Hey everybody, we are back in the Shanty and there's more COVID news. So we're not out of COVID. We're not out of the COVID woods yet. And the big news today is, of course, that the Food and Drug Administration has announced its full approval for the Pfizer and biotech COVID-19 vaccination. So the vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine at least, is now fully approved for Americans as young as 16 years old. And the emergency use authorization that we were operating under is gone, and the vaccine has full approval. Why is that important? Well, it raises some issues here. And let's start with the president, because that's going to get us where we want to go. In a speech today, President Biden addressed this issue. And as you all know, the president has in effect mandated the vaccine for all federal employees and members of the military. There's exceptions, but basically he's mandated the vaccine. And here's what he said in a speech today. If you are a business leader, a nonprofit leader, a state or local leader who has been waiting for full FDA approval to require vaccinations, I call on you now to do it. Require it. Do what I did last month. Require your employees to get vaccinated or face strict requirements, period, end quote. That is a pretty strong statement from the President of the United States. It's as strong as you can get without the federal government passing a law mandating vaccines. The President went on to talk about how vaccines have been around forever and ever and ever, and there's no polio or smallpox or anything anymore because of vaccines, and this should be nothing new, and people should now go out and get the vaccine. And because it's now FDA approved, at least the Pfizer is, Johnson and Johnson and Moderna's going to submit their approval, it looks like next month, Johnson and Johnson by the end of the year. The reason Johnson and Johnson is taking longer is they are now testing a 2-shot regime. So we'll probably have 3 fully approved vaccines by the end of the year, but we've got one now. So if what was holding people up was full FDA approval of the vaccine, we now have full FDA approval of the vaccine. So why are we talking about that? That's not really an employment issue. It is because it raises the question, again, for you, and we dealt with this a long, long time ago. I think Santa Claus was in the Shanty, maybe the first time we dealt with this. Can you require the vaccine? And you all know by now the answer to that is yes. And if that wasn't clear under the emergency use authorization, it's pretty clear now, given the fact that the FDA has approved the Pfizer vaccine fully, that a private employer can require the vaccine. But I want to go over that just to remind everybody of what that means. And we're going to start with let's start with the 2 lawsuits, the 2 big lawsuits that have come out so far on vaccination requirements. And remember, these requirements were both put in place before full FDA approval, and yet they both went for the employer. The first case is Bridges versus Houston Methodist Hospital. That's a case down in Texas. It was filed in June. It was decided in June. And 153, I think it was 153-ish members of this hospital. It was 117 members of this hospital filed a lawsuit over the health system's vaccine mandate. And they argued that it was illegal to force people to get an experimental drug. At the time, all we had was emergency use authorization. And the judge in that case said, yeah, this is not an experimental drug. Well, it's even more clear that it's not an experimental drug now. The 117 employees lost. Houston Methodist Hospital is now 100% vaccinated, except for those people that have a legitimate exception to getting the vaccine. We'll talk about that in a minute. The other case we want to talk about is the Indiana University case, which is different in that it was filed by students, not employees, but it's a pretty broad case. And the interesting thing about that is Indiana University is a public university. So they have a higher standard they have to meet when they mandate something. There's constitutional issues associated with that. And as you may recall, the Indiana University students argued that they were being forced by the government to give up their right to bodily medical integrity or something like that. The lower court said, no, you're not. You've got all kinds of choices here. You can get the shot. You can take your classes online. You can take a semester off. You can go to school online. Those were all available options for these employees. You can take any one of those, so you're not being forced to do that. That case went up to the circuit court, which denied the students' appeal, and it ultimately went to the Supreme Court to Judge Barrett. Judge Barrett she oversees the Seventh Circuit. She had two choices here. She could have referred it to the full court for decision, or she could have decided on her own. She, interestingly enough, chose to decide on her own and dismiss the case. So far, employers wanting to make people get vaccines, 2 for 2. All right? So let's go back to what we do know about what you can require with respect to the vaccine. And to do that, we have to go back to the ADA, the EEOC's guidance, called What You Should Know About COVID-19 and the ADA Rehabilitation Act and other EEO laws. And there's a series of questions and answers in there on vaccines that I want to remind you of. And the first one is this: under the ADA, Title VII, and other federal employment non-discrimination laws, may an employer require all employees physically entering the workplace to be vaccinated for COVID-19. And as I said back in the day when they put this out, the EEOC kind of punted, and they did kind of punt. And what they said was federal EEOC laws do not prevent an employer from requiring all employees physically entering the workplace to be vaccinated for COVID-19, subject to the reasonable accommodation provisions of Title VII and the ADA and other EEO considerations discussed below. The bottom line for that is simple. As a private employer, when the president gets on Twitter and the news and every place he's being broadcast, and he says to you, I urge you to require vaccines, the EEOC is saying you may require vaccines, with exceptions, okay? And I'm here to remind you about those two exceptions, the two big exceptions that you need to worry about. The first is, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Any employee who comes to you and says, I have a medical reason that I can't, not that I don't want, that I can't take the vaccination, you have to enter into the interactive process with them and explore reasonable accommodations, okay? Can you ask for medical information proving the employee can't take the vaccine? Yes, 100% you can. You don't have to take their word for it. And when they tell you, I don't have to tell you that because of HIPAA, blah, blah, that's wrong. You can ask for medical information just like you can under any run-of-the-mill ADA request for an accommodation. You get to get medical information that proves that they actually have a disability that prevents them from getting the vaccine. Now, depending on the nature of the employee, what kind of accommodations are we talking about that might be available for somebody who can't get the vaccine? Well, there's all kinds of things that you can do. The first and the easiest for some people, not for all people, because some people can't do their job at home, but for some people is to allow them to work remotely. Right? The days of saying to people, can't work remotely, we talked about that before. They're kind of over. It might be a reasonable accommodation to allow people to work remotely, but there are other things you can consider, like face masks and shields and maybe hazmat gear and putting the employee in a job where they're physically distanced and separated from other people, and all of those things that you need to consider. But the key here is what you have to do is engage in that interactive process and discuss reasonable accommodations. And if there is a reasonable accommodation available that doesn't cause you an undue hardship, and by the way, don't forget, undue hardship can include a direct threat to the safety of others, then you have to make that reasonable accommodation to that employee. The next thing is the religious accommodation under Title VII. Now, the EEOC says in their guidance, if somebody comes to you and says they have a religious belief that prohibits them from getting the vaccine, you should just take their word for it. I want you to be a little cautious there, and maybe that's true. But, so for example, if you know that the employee is, maybe a Christian Scientist, I think they don't believe in modern medical treatment. I could be wrong. I don't mean to insult anybody who's a Christian Scientist, but I'm using that as an example. Let's say it's somebody who says they can't take medical treatment. You know they're a member of that religion. They've talked about it to you before. You know that they don't take medical treatment. Then you can't get evidence that they're actually members of that religion. If, on the other hand, you have an objective basis for questioning their sincerity or their sincere religious belief, then you can ask for information. But before you do that, you need to call us, because there you can trip. Now, the other thing you need to know is the obligation to accommodate under Title VII's religious exemption is not nearly as high as it is under the ADA and the undue hardship standard there. So you want to talk to your lawyer before you turn somebody down who asks for a religious exemption, and you can call us and we can do that. This is going to be forefront in our minds again as the president comes out and says what he said today on the news. And you're going to start getting employees who are going to ask you what you're going to do about this. Employees who don't want to get the vaccination and employees who want you to get everybody vaccinated. I've been reading a lot on this lately, and there are tons of articles out there, and you should go read them. And there's just as many that say you should make people get the vaccine because that's actually a recruiting tool. People are going to want to come to work for you if they know their work environment is safe, as there are articles saying, don't make people get the vaccination because we don't have enough employees as it is right now, and we can't afford to lose the ones we have. So those are the things you need to balance. But I did want to touch on this again briefly today. That's what these Shanty things are for, right? To tell you what's going on. Because it's going to be in everybody's mind now that the president has spoken on it and now that we do have FDA approval. And we are seeing more and more and more and more big, major employers requiring the vaccine, at least for their employees that can work from home. Not so much in the manufacturing environment yet, but at least for their employees that can work from home. So as you read about this and as you see about this and as you think about what you want to do, those are the things that you should be thinking about and keeping in mind. Thanks very much. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.